a booklet that was put out by the Church of God Seventh Day. I realized when I was checking that I'd actually left it at home, but I was just going to give some quotations. I think I remember some of the points that I was going to make from it, and one of the points was that the feast days are connected with the sacrificial system. That's one of the arguments that I will outline. But a major treatment was given to the issue of the feast days by the Seventh-day Adventists, at least as represented by one of their prominent scholars, Ron Dupree, who has 2 doctorates in theology. Actually, he has 3 doctorates, 2 doctorates in theology and a doctor of ministry. And he has held quite prominent teaching and administrative positions in the Seventh-day Adventist church. Quite a worthy scholar. And a few years ago, he responded to the arguments about Sabbath keeping, and he produced this full-length book, Feast Keeping and the Faithful, Should Christians Observe the Annual Feast Days? I've read it thoroughly, and at our Monday night Bible study, I gave an almost point-by-point refutation. So I've considered his arguments, but I do not find that they stand, and I will give you reasons why. So what are the major reasons that Sabbatarians give for not keeping the feast days? And one of the things I must note soon, and it will be prominent throughout the presentation, is that Sabbatarians are forced to resort to the arguments that Sunday people use against the Sabbath in showing why they don't keep the feast days. It's very curious and, in fact, humorous. Because last week, as we went through the arguments that Sunday keepers use about the Sabbath being under the Old Covenant, Sabbath being Israel's feast day, Israel's special days, the Sabbath being a part of the temple system and so on, you will find that the Sabbatarians, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Church of God Seventh-day use these same arguments against the feast days. And the annoying tendency of non-Sabbatarians to draw on general statements about the law in the Pauline writings which seem negative, to draw on general statements to knock Sabbath keeping, not realizing that those general statements would apply to all of the commandments, including the moral commandments. Well, the Seventh-day Adventist Church of God Seventh-day end up doing the same thing. One of their main arguments is Colossians 2:16. They say Colossians 2:16 throws out the feast days, but not the weekly Sabbath. We'll get to that. So these here are about 9 main arguments, main lines of evidence as the non-feast keepers would see it for the non-observance of the feast days. 1, the feast days, unlike the seventh-day Sabbath, was not given at creation. What is distinctive about the Sabbath? And as one Seventh-day Adventist told me this week, I myself had made such a strong case for the creation ordinance of the Sabbath. I myself had taken the Sabbath away from the Old Covenant and the temple and all of these things. I had done such a good job, he said, that how can I now come back and say that the Sabbath is not in a class on its own? So that I had done such a good job in showing that the Sabbath is in a class by itself, that it will be hard for me now to come and try to push up these feast days on them. Brother Clark, is there another fan or so? Please let us have some direct cooling this summer. So the first main argument is the Sabbath is special because the Sabbath is given from Genesis 2. All of these feast days came long after, when you had the temple system, when you had the Levitical system, when you had the sacrificial system. The Sabbath is above all of that. The Sabbath is it has a particular status of its own, and therefore, the Sabbath cannot be classed with the feast days. That's one. Then also, the Sabbath was put in a special part of the ark along with the 10 commandments. A special part of the ark with the 10 commandments. The feast days were not a part of that special arrangement. Now, as I go through, Sabbatarians who are here, who have taken the time to be with us, and you have made that sacrifice, you will notice that I will cover your reasons for not keeping the feast days. So, this presentation will be important because I'm not just coming and giving arguments for the feast days. I am considering your objections. What if I succeed in showing that your objections are not valid? At least you should start to listen to me more keenly to see whether I can then make a positive case for these feast days. If now you realize that the reasons that you believe that the feast days should not be kept, if you realize now that, boy, you are standing on not so solid ground, your ears should be perked up even more. And at least I want you to know that I am acquainted with the reasons why you don't keep the feast days. Those of you who do know about the feast days, I am very much acquainted. I have thought about those reasons. And I want to give you my reasons why I think they are not valid. It is always good to know that when somebody is critiquing your position, that he at least is thoroughly acquainted with what your position is. Too often we find people are critiquing positions, and they are not really thoroughly acquainted with those positions. And in fact, they misrepresent those positions. So, you would assign me some credibility if I show familiarity with the arguments that you have. So the first major argument is that the Sabbath is in a class, the seventh-day Sabbath is in a class by itself in the creation week, while the feast days, Johnny, come lately. And Lloyd, I'm very glad that you have made it to this presentation. My long-time SDA friend, deep student of the Word, whose interaction I would crave, because he's a man of very deep study. And I had made the point, Lloyd, before you had come in, that the argument is used that the Sabbath was given at creation. And I mentioned our conversation this week about my having made what seemed to be strong arguments for the uniqueness of the seventh-day Sabbath. It having been created in the first week and being before the temple and the Levitical system and so on, and that the feast days came long after, and therefore the Sabbath is in a class by itself. So I'm going through now the main arguments given by Seventh-day Adventist, Church of God, Seventh-day Baptists, and others for not keeping the annual Sabbaths. That's the first. The second argument is that the Sabbath was a part of the 10 Commandments that had a special place in the ark. Feast days were not there. The Sabbath was there, showing its uniqueness in relation to the other Sabbaths, showing its distinctiveness in relation to the other Sabbath. And unlike people like me who would try now to bring the Sabbath into the company, the feast days into the company of the Sabbath, God put the seventh-day Sabbath in a special category. So we must be wary of people like the Armstrongs who have tried to push up these feast days where they don't belong. Another reason is that the Ten Commandments were written by the very fingers of God. God himself wrote it. Not like the other laws that Moses wrote. God himself engraved these 10 commandments, including the fourth, the feast days, Sabbaths. Moses wrote them. So all of these reasons show that the Sabbath is in a special class. The seventh-day Sabbath is in a special class. Because the finger of God wrote that. And then another reason is that the feast days are just types and shadows. That's a phrase that the Seventh-day Adventists like to use. They're types and shadows. They are sanctuary types. They really pointed to the work of Christ in the sanctuary. They were types that met their antitype in Jesus Christ, unlike the Sabbath, which came from creation. So all of these feast days were fulfilled in Christ. You know, Christ was killed on the Passover, sent the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. All of these days pictured Christ, you know, I mean, and they were all fulfilled in Christ. We don't need to keep them. They were part of the law of Moses rather than the law of God. There's the law of God, which is the 10 Commandments, including the fourth. And then you have the law of Moses. So the feast days were part of the law of Moses. The Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath, law of God. The feast days were part of the ceremonial law, while the Sabbath is a part of the moral law. Plus, the feast days could only be observed in Jerusalem anyway. Can't be that be observed by Gentiles. They were to be observed in Jerusalem, whereas the Sabbath is universal. Universal, we see it in Genesis 2. And the holy days are a part of the Levitical system. Now, I bet you Sabbatarians here that I have covered your main arguments. I've covered your main arguments against keeping the feast days. I've studied every single one of your main arguments. I have read your leading top Adventist scholar, Professor Ron Dupree, was given a full-length treatment of the feast days. I've read works done by other leading Seventh-day Adventist scholars like Richard Davidson, highly credible professor at Andrews. Others also, including those who have done doctoral theses on the feast days. And I want to, in this presentation, give you the results of my examination. Now, one of the points that Baldwin makes, Dr. Baldwin, who was a long-time Seventh-day Adventist minister, pastor of 33 churches, an Adventist for 50 years, associate professor at Northern Caribbean University, who recently defected and wrote this book, The Person of Jesus, God's Obligatory Sabbath. One of the arguments he makes, which I believe is sound, a lot of his arguments are not sound, but I believe this section that he has here, the inseparable link of all the Old Testament Sabbaths. Now, he has an axe to grind. I know. But whether he has an axe to grind is besides the point. He might have an axe to grind and he coincides with the truth. So, you know, philosophically, you can't use that. I mean, I could well be paranoid, but the fact that I'm paranoid doesn't really mean that some people are not really out to get me. I could be paranoid and some people are out to get me, so you can't use that argument. So irrespective of what his motives are, he happens to coincide with the truth. But the link between. He says that there is a link between the Sabbath and the feast days that Adventists have not understood, and that this light, I will go back to his work on that. But one of the misunderstandings about the feast days, and even a learned man like Ron Dupree, with 3 doctoral degrees, makes a signal error in this book, Feast Keeping and the Faithful. I go to page 94. He says, I quote, "Thus, the repeated testimony of Scripture is clear. It is impossible and illegitimate to separate the sacrifices from the actual appointed seasons. For by divine inspiration, the specifically stated central purpose of the set times, meaning the feast days, is to perform sacrifices." So this is his view. The feast days were just facilities to perform sacrifices. They were set up to perform sacrifices, and clearly Sabbath was not. So he says, in other words, the festal calendar and the actual sacrifices are intentionally, incontrovertibly, inextricably intertwined. We're going to test Dupree's knowledge of the Bible. We can't test his knowledge of theology because he has 3 doctoral degrees to attest to that. But we want to see whether he knows Bible. He says on page 95 of the book, as is obvious, one of the primary purposes for these seasons was to repeatedly and actively remind God of his great plan. That's not the part. Hence, this is the section. Because of the impossibility, and he puts in italics impossibility, because of the impossibility of separating the actual animal sacrifices from the literal observance of the annual festival calendar, no believing Christian can ever appropriately keep any appointed yearly season. You cannot keep it. It is illegitimate to keep the feast days because the feast days were inextricably, incontrovertibly intertwined with the sacrificial system, which we all agree has been abrogated. Now, this is what Dupree says. Dupree says all the feast days are connected with sacrifices. I offer you Exodus 12 as a direct and incontrovertible refutation of that view. Exodus 12. Leading Adventist theologian. In fact, he has also written a book on Colossians 2:16, trying to show that the weekly Sabbath is not included in Colossians 2:16 only. An entire book, which I have. I try to read what all the critics say on points that they disagree with me. So I have his book, very strained explanations, which don't stand. Entire book on Colossians 2:16, trying to show where it abolishes feast days, but it doesn't abolish the weekly Sabbath. Later, I will quote another Adventist theologian, this time the chairman of the Department of Religion at Andrews, Professor Richardson. I'm going to quote him against Ron Dupree. So, yes. Chairman of the Department of Religion, William Richardson. Another outstanding. The Adventist Church has produced some really brilliant theologians. Very incidentally, for those who feel that the arguments against the dietary laws are so strong. Jerry Muscala did a PhD thesis on that, which is a must read, where he really takes apart a lot of the arguments. But that's another subject. He's another very fine SDA theologian. I like to read the Journal of the Adventist Theological Society. Puts out some very fine work. But this is a not so fine work that I must deal with today. Exodus 12. It's one thing to know scholarship, but you must know the Bible too. It's good to know Greek, good to know Hebrew, good to know what the theologians are saying and so on, but you must know the text. Know the text. The very first holy day that is mentioned by God in Scripture, mentioned before even Israel had left Egypt. In fact, the very first time we see a command for any Sabbath to be kept, this time the annual Sabbath. Remember in Genesis 2, to be fair to the non-Sabbatarians, there is no direct command to keep the Sabbath. I believe that the context shows that the example that God gave by resting on the Sabbath and Sabbathizing the seventh day logically leads to the fact that he intended our first parents and others to keep it. But there is no direct command, we have to admit. The first direct command we see for the weekly Sabbath is Exodus 16. But before Exodus 16, we have Exodus 12, where the command is given to keep a Sabbath, an annual Sabbath, before the command given, before the command recorded, let me be precise, for the weekly Sabbath. You will see in this, I have some other surprises in this presentation too. I have some other surprises vis-a-vis weekly Sabbath and annual Sabbaths. The first time Israel is referred to as a congregation is Exodus 12. This is before they left Egypt. This is before the temple, tabernacle, and all of that. We see God's holy days being introduced from Egypt. Not in wilderness, like the seventh-day Sabbath. From in Egypt we see the holy days being introduced via the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day festival. Sabbatarian brethren, I know you have been at church since this morning, but I want you to listen to very carefully. We just read the emphatic statements of Ron Dupree. The feast days are tied up with sacrifices. You can't have feast days without sacrifices. The purpose of feast days was sacrifices. That's Ron Dupree. I'm going to read Bible now. Exodus 12, 15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove the leaven out of your houses. Watch how you keep it. Watch how it was to be kept. The first day remove the leaven out of your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, he shall be cut off from Israel. You do not eat the leavened products for the 7 days. We won't be able to go into all the meanings of the feast days today. Remember, the purpose of this presentation is to establish that the feast days are to be kept. The intricate meanings would have to be left to another presentation. We need, because I don't want to keep you too long, we need to establish the continuity. After you find out that it is to be kept, then we can find out the reasons. So forget about the mechanics of it now. What we want to see is we are testing Dupree's emphatic statement. He had told us. And if we were just to take it on his say-so, because he has 3 doctorates and don't read the Bible, I was reading a book by a sociologist this week about dangers of the internet and the phenomenon he calls cascades, and how you have the cascade phenomenon on the internet where a lot of people are saying the same things and are retweeting certain things, and you would get the impression, well, all of these masses of people have done the investigation. Well, what happens is that one person puts out something, another person likes it, and the other person likes it. And it's really just, you have a few people who are influencing large numbers, and then you get the impression that there is this overwhelming consensus. And the writer, Professor Sunstein, a brilliant fellow, used to be at Harvard and worked with Obama for a few years. He showed how that is affecting the democratic order, because people are kind of just following what a few people are saying. And the internet facilitates that. You have that sense that all of these people believe this thing. So, the fake news phenomena is one thing, but you have more sophisticated kinds of fake news. A lot of people on the internet believe all kind of foolish things, and they go along. So, in this age, we ought to be even more careful about what we accept on people's say-so. We have to examine things for ourselves. Watch this now. Watch how the feast of unleavened bread was kept. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Take out the bread out of your house. Don't eat any for 7 days. On the first day you must hold an assembly, so you must come together. The 7th day you must hold an assembly, come together, note the things you must do to keep it. The things that were required of Israel. You should observe the feast days, for on this day the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Not one thing about any sacrifices. No lamb to be sacrificed. Nothing that the Israelites were asked to do on this originally given days of unleavened bread. Nothing involved any sacrifices. And you have random priests saying you cannot keep feast days. You cannot keep any feast days without sacrifices. And we see in Exodus 12 that is absolutely and thoroughly refuted as a fake information. When you're a scholar, we can't trust that you know the Bible itself. Your credibility is shot. Not saying everything is simple, but that's bad. It's poor. You haven't done your work. It is not true. And I have documents from the Church of God 70 with similarly careless statements that the feast days were just occasions for offering sacrifices. Not. Later on, when there was a Levitical system, of course, sacrifices were held on the feast days. But when you read Numbers 28, sacrifices were also held on the weekly Sabbath. Sacrifices were held every time there was an assembly. You had daily sacrifices. So the fact that sacrifices were held on the Sabbath, of course, 70 Adventists will come back and say, yeah, but originally it wasn't. Yes, well, the same thing. When the Sabbath was a part of the temple system and the Levitical system, it assumed certain characteristics which were not essential to it. The same thing with the feast days, certainly with this feast day. You cannot therefore assert that the feast days are inextricably tied up, as Ron Dupree said. Wrong. Feast days were not. There's another thing. Suppose I showed you that the feast days, rather than a Johnny-come-lately phenomenon, actually had a provision from Genesis 1, not Genesis 2, where we read about Sabbath. Suppose I show you feast days in the book of Genesis. You'll be startled, Because nothing in your religious tradition prepares you for that. If you hadn't read Baldwin's book would probably shock a lot of Adventists when they see that. We had known this long ago. Who was I show you? That before Genesis 2, where the Sabbath is given. From Genesis 1. Because one of the major arguments why Adventist Church of God Seventh-day don't keep the feast days is that, well, it's not in Genesis, you know. Sabbath special in a class. Don't want to give my good friend Martin any heart attack here today. You know. I've been suffered heart attack. I know what it is like, so I don't want to give him any. But so I prepare you by saying there is something. And I draw your attention to Genesis 1:14. Draw your attention to Genesis 1:14. And you see, the problem is that we are reading English versions of the Bible. We're reading English versions with English words. And we're not understanding the implication. We're not understanding that we are really at a serious disadvantage when you just pick up an English version and you go and read. You read over so many things, there are so many clues that you miss. When you have, especially the King James Version. Because when I was a teenager and I'm reading this, when I was going to school and I read Genesis 1:14, there's no way I could have understood what I'm understanding now, having been shown the Hebrew. But look at this. From primary school, we're reading this. Genesis 1:14, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons. I'm saying, boy, summer, autumn, winter, spring, summer, autumn, seasons. That's why I know seasons to be when I go to school or come. That's why I know seasons. And then I pick up one of the finest commentary series that exists, the Word Biblical Commentary, written by Sunday keepers, non-Sabbatarians. Pick up the Word, giving a commentary on Leviticus 23 and giving some remarks on Genesis 1:14, page 375. Seasons. What do I see? Break it into its thought. Genesis 1:14 supports the latter by affirming that the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, stars, have been created by God to fix the times for these high days. It turns out that the Hebrew word for seasons is moed, which means appointed times for festivals. Not season, summer, autumn, spring. So I can't blame people who are just reading their English versions for not catching what this is actually saying. The Hebrew moed. And then if you do a word study, you will see many translations where the same moed means feast days, festivals, appointed times, including Sabbath. All the appointed times. So I'm reading this evangelical professor, John Hartley. Genesis 1:14 supports the latter by affirming that the heavenly bodies have been created by God to fix the times. These are the feasts of Yahweh because they are occasions to worship and praise Him for abundantly blessing the fields and the flocks. He has no dog in the race. He's an evangelical just quoting. He didn't even know that I was going to be quoting him in affirmation of my feast keeping. He's just a scholar giving information and showing that it's not some moed. God made provision in the creation week for the keeping of the feast days. He appointed the heavenly body. He appointed them to show the seasons. Genesis 1:14, before he made the Sabbath. This was the fourth day, before the seventh day. He made the provision. He appointed them for this purpose. In fact, I don't want to go into another discussion, but there's a very good scholarly article, again, put out by Adventist Theological Society on the two creation stories, which said that, one of the questions that arises that, so if you make the sun and so on in the fourth day, how did vegetation come about? And you have scientific problem. So the scholar was pointing out that actually in the creation, God had actually, in the beginning, had already created sun and all these elements. So when it says the fourth day now he designates. They were already created, but he appointed them on the fourth day for that particular purpose. It was not a contradiction. It was already made, but they were already there, but it was appointed to play this purpose. For the feast days, for the appointed times. That designation done on the fourth day, before the seventh day. Before the seventh day. And Baldwin, as a Seventh-day Adventist, came to understand that late. But he points out, we go to what he says about that. He says another factor that demonstrates an inseparable link among all the Sabbaths is the fact that, like the weekly Sabbath, the other so-called ceremonial Sabbaths have their interpretive origins in the creation account of Genesis 1 and 2. By the way, he says, as was demonstrated in chapter 1, calling the Sabbaths or any law ceremonial, as opposed to others which are moral, are shameful proof texting. There's no dichotomy in Scripture. He says, speaking of the sun, moon, and star, Genesis 1:14 says, let them be for signs and seasons. The Hebrew word translated seasons, moed, must not be understood to mean spring, summer, autumn, winter. Rather, moed signifies the designated holy times, like Sabbath, new moon, Passover. That's what moed is. He gives the example. He says the ancient Israelite reading of Genesis 1:14 would have understood it to be referring to the holy times of the Hebrew sacred calendar. That's what the original people understood Genesis 1:14 to be. So contrary to the view that these feast days are some little Johnny come lately things and, an afterthought of God after sin came into the world. The provisions were made. He made the move to mark the moed seasons. Thus, it is not true, as we often claim as Seventh-day Adventists, that the weekly Sabbath originated in creation, but the other Sabbaths did not. They all have their roots in the creation story. This is just on the matter of the language. And you can go look. There are many instances where the same moed translated, appointed times, seasons, appointed festivals. Leviticus 23, when it says, these are my holy days, appointed times. And when you come to Leviticus 23, those who, you can't de-link the weekly Sabbath from the annual Sabbath. In fact, I want to tell you a thing that Baldwin points out that for me for many, many years, I myself just read and never saw it. When Baldwin pointed out that Genesis 20, that mentions the Sabbath. See again, even me, I also mention the Sabbath. Baldwin points out when you read Genesis 20, the seventh day is a Sabbath. No, I've been reading for many years and I read this Sabbath, even as a holy day keeper. I used to read this Sabbath. But it is not the Sabbath. It is a Sabbath. He says, for many years, I have had SDA members in my congregations to read Exodus 28. So it's a long time preparing himself. Same had them read it from another version other than the King James version. But I stopped reading King James a long time. In fact, when I check back even my RSV, I used to say, but I was always reading the. So for many years, I've had my Seventh-day Adventist members in my congregations read Exodus 28:11 from another version other than the King James version. In almost all the cases, they read what was in their minds instead of what was actually printed on the paper was different. Probably if you are an SDA, you should stop right now and just do that before. Most Seventh-day Adventists read in Exodus 20:10 from a version other than King James, who said, but the seventh day is the Sabbath. When the text actually reads, but the seventh day is a Sabbath. He says you can't determine whether a definite article is here by reading the English versions, of course. You have to go back to the Hebrew. And remember that Baldwin's main expertise, Baldwin is a textual critic. That's why he got his PhD thesis in. He's a textual critic. The Hebrew article is used, among other things, to indicate specific identity. The writer of Hebrews 20 wishes to communicate that the seventh day is of sabbatical quality. The seventh day is a Sabbath. A Sabbath means it is a certain species of days. It is a certain class of days. It is not a special. It is a class. It is of sabbatical class. It is not a regular day. It is a Sabbath day. It is not the Sabbath day. There is an inextricable link between the seventh-day Sabbath and the regular Sabbaths. And if you're a Sunday keeper who is here, you have ammunition against all Sabbatarians who come to you now with Sabbath argument. Unless they are dealing with all the Sabbaths, they have no moral authority to be talking to you about weekly Sabbath. Because all of them go together. And any argument they can use against the annual Sabbath, you can use those same arguments. I just remember the time I left David Clayton's paper also about the feast days. He was repeating the same weak arguments that Sunday people use against Sabbath. Going to Galatians 4, going to Galatians 2. David, a good friend of mine, again misses the point. About 15 pages of repeating the same Sunday keeper arguments against Sabbath, against feast days. Baldwin says, if you think their Sabbath is a solo occurrence regarding the seventh-day Sabbath, I'll cite you here a few other instances. Exodus 31:15. All the time I've been reading thee. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest. Exodus 35:2. For 6 days work may be done, but the seventh day you shall have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest. And of course, Leviticus 23, which we'll go to now. So I want to say that one, we have seen that the feast days were mentioned, were given as commands specifically before even the weekly Sabbath in Exodus 12. Last week I made a big point that Exodus 20 was before the Sinaitic covenant, and the Israelites were already asked to show their fidelity to God by keeping the weekly Sabbath. Well, from Exodus 12, they were asked, before they left Egypt, they were asked, they were commanded to keep at least the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now go to Leviticus 23. I am making the point that the Sabbaths, all of them are together. That God put them together, and whom God put together, let no man put asunder. It's only men have put asunder these Sabbaths. They are married together. Holy matrimony. Who divorced them? Not the Bible. I want you to notice that in the very passage that outlines all the feast days together, how the passage is introduced. Notice how it is introduced. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, these are my feasts which you shall proclaim as holy convocations. These are my holy feasts. Listen to which is the first feast. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. The first feast day mentioned is the 7th-day Sabbath. The 7th-day Sabbath is classed with the other feast days mentioned in Leviticus 23. This idea of extricating the 7th-day Sabbath from the other feast days is not a biblical idea at all. In fact, the Seventh-day Adventists used to keep the Sabbath from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Until someone stumbled on this same Leviticus 23, which they would otherwise despise. Mrs. White used to keep, it's in historical record, a 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Sabbath, Friday evening to thing. Some also even today in Jamaica, many Jamaicans, when you say keep Sabbath, say, boy, at 6 o'clock. I went there at 7 time and Sabbath used to be at 8 o'clock in the night. People would see and tell you, say, boy, at 6 o'clock. The tradition was hard to die. It was when the Seventh-day Adventists went to Leviticus 23 and read a reference to one holy day, that they realized that the Sabbath is kept from sunset to sunset. Now today there are a few crazy people who believe that Sabbath starts in the morning. You go on the internet, you read all kinds of craziness. So there are people who hold that, but the Seventh-day Adventists understood that, as the Jews. Because when Jesus was here with the Jews, he wasn't keeping Sabbath from morning. He was keeping it. The Jews have always kept their Sabbaths from eve to eve. But how you know it's from eve to eve? Because if you just read your King James Version and you see that the evening and the morning was the first day, probably you have some other foolish people to know who start at the evening and end of the morning. The internet has multiplied foolishness by proportions beyond which I can calculate. Leviticus 23 and verse 32. This is where the Adventists went and began to keep the Sabbath rightly from sunset to sunset. Leviticus 23:32. It shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest to you. You shall afflict yourselves on the 9th day of the month. Begin at even, that's the evening. From even to eve you shall keep your Sabbaths. This was in reference to the Day of Atonement. But in the reference to the Day of Atonement, the Lord gave the general principle of Sabbath keeping, because the Sabbath is like the Day of Atonement. They are both Sabbaths. They have the same sabbatical quality. They are observed the same time. Actually, some of the people who keep Sabbath starting in the morning, they actually keep atonement from the evening, because the atonement, the annual Sabbaths are different from the weekly Sabbath. Weekly Sabbath you do in the morning, but the annual one. Adventists are not so foolish. They know that it is eve to eve, if you're talking about any Sabbath. They've had the benefit of training. But it is in the Leviticus 23, and from a feast day, why the Adventists and others of us who are Sabbatarians, we know when the Sabbath is to be kept, when the Sabbath starts and when the Sabbath ends. From eve to eve you shall celebrate your Sabbath. The weekly Sabbath, the annual Sabbath is the same Sabbath. The only difference that one occurs weekly and the other occurs yearly. Now, this part about the special part of the ark. Now, you have to be careful about, sometimes your points prove too much. Sometimes your points prove too much. When you say you don't keep the feast days because they were not in a special part of the ark, what implications that has for your preaching so fervidly? I'm excluding Seventh-day Baptists now. What makes you preach so fervently that people should not eat pork? That is a sin. It's wrong. That law, even though it was before the Old Covenant, and that's not the point, it was not in the special part of the ark. It was not in the Ten Commandments. Don't switch the argumentation and tell me that no, but it was before and from no time. That's not the point. You are making an hermeneutical point that the significant things to keep are in the ark and Ten Commandments. The dietary laws were not put there. So what does that make of that argument of yours? There's another major doctrine you teach that is not in here. Tithing. Tithing that you teach. That was not in the special part of the ark. If you wanted me to say, well, it was really stealing and whatever, but you are extrapolating. You cannot sustain a hermeneutical principle that the only things that can be kept are the things that were in the ark. The laws having to do with incest that are in Leviticus 18, which are important, which tell you cannot marry to your sister, you cannot marry to your daughter. That important part of the law was not in the special side of the ark where the Ten Commandments are. You have to be careful when you are making arguments. You are battling Sunday keepers, so you come up with a set of arguments. Those arguments turn around and trip you up because you are not consistent. The argument proves too much. Drop it. It is you're playing Russian roulette. You cannot use that argument. You cannot use that because it was not in any, the feast day is not there. And also this argument, put aside the fact that I have now shown you that the feast days are indeed mentioned in Genesis. Put that aside. Again, your hermeneutical principle that I'm questioning. That if something is not given in the... You're only taking significance from the garden or from Genesis. The law against incest was not given at creation. Indeed, for a long period, the only way for the earth's population to have been multiplied was through relatives marrying relatives. Where did Cain get his wife? See, I'm always blessed of all the things I've studied. The fact that I've studied philosophy is what I prize most, both in my work as a journalist and as a pastor. And I think every theology student should study philosophy. I praise the Catholics for that and the great emphasis that they place on philosophical training. But I find so much bad exegesis today is not so much because the people are not theologically trained. They are not philosophically trained. They're not trained enough in logical reasoning. They're not trained to spot bad arguments. to spot inconsistency, to spot non sequitur reasoning, to see when an argument has a potential to trip you up, to see the consequences of an argument. If you continue to use this, that boy is just creation. The law of incense came late. So to say, even if you were to say that feast days came late, you can't say feast days should not be kept just because they came late. It is not the timing of the giving of the law that determines whether it's to be kept or not. You can't use that. It's a worthless argument. That you agree with that? So there are a lot of weak arguments that are used. Of course, the argument too about everything was fulfilled. The feast days are fulfilled in Christ. The feast days were kind of shadows. You look at them and you see the types. We proved last week, Baldwin and these other critics of the Sabbath, the argument that they are putting forward, and it is not a foolish argument, is that the Sabbath pointed to Christ, is that Christ is that rest. We can concede that without saying that the Sabbath is abrogated, because Hebrews 4:3 does tell us, we who have believed enter present tense that rest. We are in the rest of Christ now. We are enjoying the soteriological rest, but it does not mean that because you're enjoying the soteriological rest that you have no need to keep the type. Because the antitype has come, you have no need. No. Lord's Supper shows the Lord's death till he comes. Shows the death, and we are still to do it. The death gone. The reality has come. Why are we still keeping the Lord's Supper? Why are we still keeping communion? It is talking about a reality that has come and an historical event that is past, but we still keep it. Baptism, which pictures the death and the resurrection. We still teach that ritual. It is pointing to something that is historically past, the death and resurrection of Jesus. It is a fallacious argument to say that, well, just because, the feast days really picture things in the salvation history, and therefore it is of no value. No! I make the point, you can keep the feast days to celebrate the salvation history of Yahweh. You keep the feast days to celebrate the salvation history. It is an argument for the keeping of the feast days, not an argument for their abolition. Again, I find that it's the lack of philosophical rigor that afflicts much theological exegesis. Bad arguments. And of course, this big difference now between even ceremonial and moral law. Baldwin made a statement that Gillins in his reply, Gillins is a decent reply to Baldwin, available online. But Gillins was pointing out that, Baldwin is saying that there's no distinction between moral and ceremonial, that is patently false and whatever. While Baldwin might have explained very well, and Gillins is not a theologian, so he might have missed this. What Baldwin is saying is that the Bible itself does not make the neat distinctions. It is not to say that there are no distinctions between moral and ceremonial. You have to know how to read theologians. They're not the easiest to interpret, but we must not misrepresent them. What Baldwin and the others mean is that the Bible, that theologians can come and impose categories, but that the Bible writers, when the Bible writers were putting down that they did not make those distinctions. The Bible writers don't make distinctions between ceremonial and moral. Now, Gillins pointed out that I myself corrected corrected Baldwin, but not on his theological point. I corrected Baldwin to say, but Paul himself says that circumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments. So there are some distinctions, but the Bible writers don't make the kinds of neat distinctions. And I want to suggest this big argument made about the law of God and the law of Moses. When you read the Bible uses the terms interchangeably. And I'm going to give you just a couple instances of that, where the Bible uses the terms interchangeably. So don't hold too strictly. Why this is the law of Moses and the law of God? Because the law of Moses was really given by God. Who do you think Moses got the law from? Stop nitpicking, man. Where do you think Moses got all of the laws were given by God? It's God's laws. Moses was just a messenger. So don't make too much out of this thing about difference between law of Moses and law of God. Feast days of law of Moses. Luke 2 and verse 22. Let me debunk this before going on. Luke 2:22. If you haven't had lunch, well, I haven't had lunch either, so both of us. But we are feasting on the word. Luke 2:22. This distinction that is made always between law of God and law of Moses. False dichotomy. Luke 2:22. And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, you can't get more ceremonial than this now. Purification time. And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, Luke 2:22, they brought him, Jesus, up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Look at the parenthetical statement in 23. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. What he called law of Moses in 22, in 23 says the law of the Lord. So the regular Adventist distinction, ceremonial law, law of Moses, it is not. It's not a scriptural. 1 Chronicles 22. First Chronicles 22:12. Only may the Lord grant you this discretion and understanding, that when he gives you charge over Israel, you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and the rules that the Lord commanded Moses of Israel. You must be careful to keep the law of God. And it is then equated with the statutes of the law of Moses. The law of God, the law of Moses. This kind of distinction that is made, that is artificially imposed, is not justified by Scripture. Go to the book of Nehemiah. Finally, for this one. There are other passages. I want to give you three. I think I want Nehemiah 10:29. Nehemiah 10:29. Break it into the thought here. Join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to obey and to do all the commandments of the Lord our God. Again, law of Moses and law of God. Why are you making this big distinction between the two? So we find that these arguments, I'm going back through now the major arguments used for not keeping the Sabbath, keeping the holy days. The argument that these were just Israel's days, let me tell you, it's the same argument that the Sunday keepers come with. You find that if you talk to a Sabbatarian who does not keep the feast days, if you talk to a Sabbatarian who does not keep the feast days, he gives you the same line of arguments that the Sunday keepers who do not keep Sabbath use. All of the arguments he trots out those same tired arguments against against holy day keeping that are regularly trotted out by Sunday keepers. So you hear these were just Israel's days, Israel's national days. What Church of God 70 as a booklet where they say, these are Israel's national days. God only gave these feast days to Israel. God gave all the laws to Israel. He made the covenant with no one else. Deuteronomy 7:6 says, listen to me, the Lord chose you above all the peoples of the earth. Psalm 147 said that the Lord, he gave the law to Jacob. He has not dealt thus with any other nation. Romans 9 says God has given Israel the oracles. To them belong the adoption. To them belong the covenants. It's a non-argument about, well, God gave the law. God gave Sabbath to Israel. God gave feast days to Israel. Yes, because he was working with them. And I want to tell you, Baldwin himself points this out. Because Baldwin says, well, Seventh-day Adventists like to make this distinction between, Sabbath is special and Ten Commandments special and all the feast days, they just celebrate what went on in Egypt. Tabernacles celebrate, your 40 years of wandering, and Passover, unleavened bread celebrates what happened in Egypt. Baldwin points out. Baldwin said, wait, they forget Exodus 20? Listen to how God introduces the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20 and verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, up out of slavery. He introduces the Ten Commandments by reminding them of their historical experience. Sunday people draw on that and say, don't keep it. But we know better. So why now you're going to turn around these arguments against feast keepers? All that happened was that God contextualized. He contextualized his law to Israel's history. The Sabbath was universal. The law against stealing and killing was universal. He was already judging people by those things before there was an Israel. But just as how in Ephesians 5 he said that keep the first commandment of promise, you must honor your mother and your father. It drops the part about that your days may be long in the land. But when you read Exodus, it said the reason why you must honor your mother and your father is that your days may be long in the land. That was talking about Israel. It was a universal law contextualizing Israel's history, but not particularized. So it is a fact. It is a fact that the things of the feast were contextualized in Israel's history. It is a fact that the things of the feast were particularized, but the fact that they were particularized does not mean that they don't have transcultural meaning and that they are not universal. That's a weak and fallacious argument. Last week I had to deal with all these weak arguments of Sunday keepers, and now I have to deal with weak arguments of Sabbatarians. Weak arguments all around. Poor exegetical work all around. Colossians 2:16. Another example of the poor exegetical work. As I told you, Ron Dupree has a book which I have called Judging the Sabbath. It's not a good work. Cannot stand. He tries to make out that Colossians 2:16 is really abolishing feast days. When people who understand Colossians, and there's a tape available, I won't go in, those of you who were not at the Monday meeting, I was very extensive. It's available on YouTube. Presentation 2. I can't go through all the points, but I will just make a couple. Colossians 2 was not primarily a polemic against the Jewish legalists. The problem at Colossae was Gnosticism. The problem was asceticism. So in that part 2, you can get the tape so I can save the time. The part 2 of my presentation of on the Sabbath is available on YouTube. I give a detailed explanation of Colossians, the book itself, and then go into Colossians 2. And I pointed out that Colossians 2:16 begins, therefore let no one pass judgment. That therefore is connected with God's canceling the debt that stood against us, with God disarming the rulers and the principalities and so on. But in any event, if Colossians 2:16 does away with the feast days, it also does away with the 7-day Sabbath. You cannot extricate 7-day Sabbath from this. And I quote you now from the chairman of the religion department of the leading Seventh-day Adventist university in the world, Andrews University, Professor William Richardson, in the Ministry magazine, Ministry which goes to the Seventh-day Adventist ministers. May 1997 issue of Ministry magazine, Professor William Richardson, in an article titled, Sabbath, Was It Nailed to the Cross? He breaks with traditional Seventh-day Adventist exegesis on Colossians 2:16. I refer you, the article is available online. In fact, all the ministry archives are available online. May 1997, I asked all Adventists to read that from your ministerial journal. One of your top scholars, William Richardson, he gives the arguments. He shows why. This is referring, he says, you can't take out Sabbath and say it is referring to just feast days. In fact, he points out, and this is the consensus in the scholarship, the people who are doing the judging in Colossae were judging the Christians who were keeping these days. The Christians were keeping these days, and the ascetics were judging how they were keeping the days. Again, I won't go over the points that I made on Monday night. It's on YouTube, the part 2. Professor Richardson says, pointing out that when it says, let no man judge you in eating and drinking, in food and drink, it's not food and drink meaning the food and drink regulations of the temple. Eating and drinking, brosis and prosis. There were ascetics who were judging and saying you shouldn't eat, you shouldn't drink. And he says, in the section, the issue of the Sabbath, he says, when you read Colossians 2:16, the implication is the Sabbath being described here is a weekly Sabbath. This is what Professor Richardson has said. And you can read his arguments for that. He points out, you see that phrase? Let no one judge you in meat and drink or festival new moon Sabbath. You see that phrase? The festival new moon Sabbath. There are about 5 times in the Old Testament that same weekly Sabbath, monthly with the new moon, yearly with feasts. This particular phrase, to show you that it is referring to the weekly Sabbath also. There are 5 passages in the Old Testament where you read that same phrase. I think I had it here. 1 Chronicles 1:23-31. 1 Chronicles 1:23-31. Nehemiah 10:23. 2 Chronicles 2:4. 2 Chronicles 8:12-13. Ezekiel 45:17. The same phrase you find in Colossians 2:16. to show you that it is referring to the weekly Sabbath. Also, you go back to the Old Testament and you see that phrase. Again, some Adventists, not the scholars who know better, commonly Adventists will say, boy, especially if you look at the King James Version, say, let no man judge you in Sabbaths. See that, boy, is a plural Sabbath, it's not weekly Sabbath. But they are not theologians, so I'll forgive them. The fact of the matter is that plural, the plural Sabbaths, in the Greek uses the plural in 59 out of 60 times. In the NT, the Greek have the plural, but it means weekly Sabbath. Professor Richardson, who knows better, points that out. So don't say in Sabbath days that means it is feast days. No, it's a weekly Sabbath. In fact, I'm going to give you just a few texts where in the Greek, you're not going to start from reading your Bible. In the Greek, it is actually it is Sabbath, but in your version it is Sabbath. Matthew 12:1. Luke 6:9, Acts 16:13, just a few. In the Greek, it's actually Sabbath, but it is translated Sabbath accurately. As Professor Richardson points out, if you are not even a scholar and you read Colossians 2:16, it must refer to the weekly Sabbath also. Listen to Paul. Let no one judge you in meat and drink, or, listen to this now, follow it, or with regard to a festival, or Sabbath, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. Why would Paul be talking about the feast day Sabbath 2 times? Why would he mention the feast day Sabbath 2 times? Why the repetition? It makes better sense. It is more logical. It's 2 types of Sabbath, not 2 types, 2 different Sabbaths he's talking about. He's talking about the weekly and he's talking about the annual. In fact, I'm quoting Professor Richardson. Accordingly, Professor Richardson says, when Paul here refers to Sabbaths, listen to him, his logic is impeccable. When Paul here refers to Sabbaths, if he meant the ceremonial Sabbaths, he was needlessly repeating himself. In that case, he would be saying, quote, let no one pass judgment on you in regard to a feast day, ceremonial Sabbath, or in regard to a new moon, or in regard to ceremonial Sabbath. A statement neither logical nor likely. This is what the chairman of the religion department of the leading Seventh-day Adventist university is saying. Sometimes the assertion is made that the plural form of the word Sabbath here indicates something other than the weekly Sabbath. But the plural form is used several times for the weekly Sabbath. Listen to this, including at the heart of the 4th commandment is the plural form used in Exodus 20. This is what Professor Richardson is saying. Excellent article I recommend to you. It shows that the Sabbath is included in Colossians 2:16, but the issue is not about not keeping Sabbath. The issue is about asceticism. Weak arguments again. All of these arguments against the feast days cannot stand. All of them weak arguments. I now go to show you that, in fact, the Bible shows Jesus and the disciples keeping the feast days. How do we know that the feast days continued? I now move into the positive evidence. Those of you who are Sabbatarians, where are you now with your arguments? All of the reasons that you have used have crumbled. All your arguments about special part of ark and all of those have crumbled. I now move to show you. John 7. This is now where it gets interesting. This is where now Adventists and Church of God Seventh-day now start behaving like Sunday people. at any Seventh-day Adventist crusade, you will hear Luke 4 quoted, that Jesus, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath. And that is quoted to show that Jesus was a Sabbath keeper. At every Seventh-day Adventist crusade, they quote Acts 17. Paul, as his custom was, went into the synagogue. Acts 18, he reasoned with the Jews on the synagogue. They quoted that. And you know the answer of the Sunday keepers, which is not a foolish answer. The Sunday keepers say Paul and Jesus were not keeping Sabbath. They just went there to evangelize. It's a plausible argument. But the Adventists come back and say, no, they didn't go there to evangelize, they go there to worship. And one of the big texts used by the Adventists, Luke 4. Jesus was a Sabbath keeper. If he came back to here, he would go to church Saturday, not Sunday. Paul was a Sabbath keeper. In fact, there's an article I have, a good article, from the Journal of the Adventist Theological Society, showing it's called Paul's Sabbath observance in Acts, where he goes into a number of, Acts 13, Acts 16, when he went. Sunday people come back with all of these texts and said, no, he was just going there because Jews were there. Even when he went to the riverside, because he wanted to evangelize, we think that the arguments are weak. I defended against those arguments and stood with the Adventists last week. I am going to quote you a text in John 7. And the Adventists and the Church of God Seventh-day are going to tell me that this text does not mean what I want it to mean. It only means that Jesus, because he was a Jew, he was keeping the Jewish days, and he was just going into the synagogue because he was a Jew, and it doesn't mean anything. I'm going to go to John 7, and the same argument that the Sunday people use against Sabbath, and they defend, they are going to use now to say my argument this week. Now go to John 7. Jesus was about to go in Galilee. Verse 2. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. One, you might say, why did he say the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles? You have to understand again historical context. All the scholars know. No, none of the gospel writers uses the term the Jews more than John. This is a point of scholarship. The scholars know this. John has a particular polemic on the Jews. The phrase the Jews, used by John multiple times. None of the other writers use that more. Not even Matthew, who is they say anti-Jewish. When he says that the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand, the point is not to say, don't come with the silly point, that you see it is a Jews' Feast of Tabernacles, is not God's Feast of Tabernacles. No, that's not what the writer meant originally. You will see that Jesus' life is threatened. You will see that at first Jesus did not want to go up to the feast. The writer is meaning to say that Jesus is going in the midst of a hostile crowd. This is their major feast where they have people coming in from the diaspora. This is not a strategic time for Jesus to be there. This is a time when there are many hostile people. It says the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. His brother said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see what the works that you're doing. For no one works in secret. Jesus said to them, my time is not yet come, but your time is always here. I don't want to be killed now. The time is not here. And when you notice the context of John using the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles, this is not a slur against the feast. It's not to say, well, it's not God's feast, it's the Jews' feast. The immediate context is the threat. He says to his disciples, you go up to the feast. You go up to the feast. Is that not a command? You're going to say, no. You have some strict dispensationalists who say, you can't take anything that Jesus said as pertaining to you have Church of Christ. Church of Christ has a radical view of discontinuity. Church of Christ says, you can't even take what Jesus and others said when they were alive. What you take is Paul. Well, you can take what Jesus says. But apart from Jesus, you can't take anything that he does as normative. You have to wait until after him die and all that kind of thing. And you have to look mostly to the Pauline writings. They have a radical view of discontinuity. Well, here he says, you go up to the feast. He tells the disciples to go up to the feast. But the Sabbatarians who don't keep the feast will say, don't make anything of that man. I tell him to go up there to preach. Same time, they're holding crusades and quoting Luke 4, They're telling you that Jesus at his custom was going to synagogue. You must be consistent. If you are not willing to use John 7 to say that Jesus kept the feast, then you must not tell people about Luke 4. And you must not tell them about Acts 16 and Acts 17. And you must not use the text about Jesus, Paul going into the synagogue on the Sabbath in Acts. Do not be consistent with your arguments. You will see a very significant thing. Verse 11, the Jews were looking out for him at the feast and saying, where is he? Why would the Jews be looking out for him unless he were a regular feast keeper? The fact that the Jews were looking out for him and say, he must be here somewhere, shows that as his custom was, like the Sabbath, he was keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. It is logically compelling. They knew that he had to be there. And there was much muttering about. And we read later in verse 37, on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and preached. Jesus eventually went to the Feast of Tabernacles. He was a feast keeper. I want to show you from the New Testament documents, taking you out of the Old Testament to show you that Jesus and the apostles were feast keepers, and the early church was a feast-keeping church. I go now to the positive evidence. I give you John 7. I take you to Acts 20. Acts 20. Significantly, I take you outside of Jerusalem. One of the arguments used, Randy uses it, others, Church of God Seventh Day makes a big thing of it. Feast days can only be kept in Jerusalem. Can't keep feasts outside of Jerusalem. Well, I'm going to show you this text. I'm going to show you another one in Acts 5. And I'm going to show you yet another one in 1 Corinthians 16. When Jesus came himself, listen, the time come now. You're not going to worship in this or that mountain. You worship in spirit and truth. And so we don't need to go to Jerusalem. We don't need a temple to keep feasts. Because the feast days are universal. Its meanings are universal. That they were enacted and given to the people of Israel is not a point that is decisive about their discontinuity. Acts 20 and verse 6. Then we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Now, follow me closely. You have been listening for a long time. Stay with me. This is Acts. This is long after Jesus has been resurrected, gone to heaven. Why would Luke, the historian, Acts written largely to Gentiles, why would Luke, the historian, note that we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread? If the days of unleavened bread had been discontinued, if the early Christian communities had stopped keeping the feast days, why would the earliest recipients of the book of Acts have an assumed familiarity with the days? That the days would become calendar markers. When you're doing a literary analysis, these are relevant questions. This is a Gentile area. You need to understand this is not that. Well, it's Jerusalem, so, we understand that Jerusalem Christian took a long time. Dupree made that point. It's amazing. You should read this. Dupree in the last part sounds someone like a Sunday keeper. Him say, boy, the early Jews took a long time, man, to break away. The same man who would use Luke 23 to say, oh, the disciples went after Jesus crucified, and they would keep the Sabbath according to the commandment, The same man who would quote Acts 13 and Acts 16, is now saying, well, you would expect the Jews. It took a long time for them, to break away from their cultural practice. Hundreds of years they were keeping feast days. So when the Sunday people use it against Sabbath, why you push back? But in this case, these were Gentile believers. Certainly mixed congregation. We're not saying that Jews were not there. This is Philippi. This is not a predominantly Jewish area. And we see they're sealed by after the days of unleavened bread. After the days of unleavened bread. In fact, Mrs. White, has something to say about this. Mrs. White, in one of her writings, comments on Acts 20. Mrs. White says, at Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover. Only Luke remained with him, and the other members of the company passing on to Troas await him there. Hear Mrs. White. The Philippians were among the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts. And during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed peaceful and happy communion with them. Mrs. White, in her book, Acts of the Apostles, says that Paul was with the Philippian Christians and enjoying the feast of unleavened bread. Well, Dupree recognized that, but Dupree said, well, we don't follow we follow the Bible. That's what he says. He says, well, Mrs. White said that, but, we follow the scriptures. Mrs. White had her thing on that, but there's another quote I have from Mrs. White where she said, well, would it be that we would have a Feast of Tabernacles today? There's another quote where she talked about that. But I leave the Adventists to deal with that. I'm dealing with the Bible. But Mrs. White herself acknowledged this. I'm going to show you from one of the leading evangelical scholars today, Professor Craig Keener. His productivity is absolutely amazing. I don't know who he has been able to put out so many books. He has some volumes on Acts. This is just volume 3. His productivity is amazing. Sunday Keeper. And I want to tell you what he says here. Page 2,900 and something, yes. It's 2,958. He's commenting on Acts 20. He's commenting on Acts 20. He points out, he says in his commentary on Acts 20 and verse 6, Professor Craig Keener, Luke's record of this phase of the journey, incidentally, reveals interesting information, such as Jesus' followers reckon in time and apparently celebrating biblical festivals. This is a Sunday Keeper. A scholar, just like the word biblical commentary, with no dog in the race, commenting on the facts before him. It says, Luke's group traveling with him from Philippi, it says that Paul, Luke, and the others remained in Philippi for the days of unleavened bread. Instead of crossing to Troas immediately to rejoin the companions, notice that. He could have gone on to Troas. He remained in Philippi specifically to keep the feast with the brethren there. It was not Jerusalem. You can't tell me that he went there to evangelize. Mrs. White herself says that he went there to be with the Philippian brethren, Gentile Christians, who were Sabbath keepers and feast keepers. Listen to what Professor Keener says. that Paul, Luke, and others remained in Philippi for the days of unleavened bread instead of crossing to Troas immediately rejoined their others, suggests that they continue to observe the Jewish festivals. It suggests that they continued to observe the Jewish festivals. That such festivals remain quite familiar to at least the Jewish Christians in the first century, as attested in John's Gospel. Suggests that the Christians preserved many of the customs longer than the Gentile Christendom many later centuries had often assumed. In other words, I'm saying, it's long time people who keep those things that later on, when the paganized Christianity came about, and they had assumed that, well, the earliest Christians abandoned Sabbath and abandoned feast days. That is not true. He's saying if you look at the historical record here in Acts, it shows that the people them hold on to this Sabbath and these feast days thing longer. In his view, they didn't get enlightened so early. We follow scriptures alone. Listen to what he says. It is unlikely that either Paul or Luke preserve such designations as merely chronological markers. Paul assumed that the Gentiles had knowledge of these feasts. 1 Corinthians 16:8, which I'll go to. This is what Keena is saying. And he presupposes some theological instruction about them in 1 Corinthians 5, which I have to go to. Keena is saying that if you look at 1 Corinthians 16, if you look at 1 Corinthians 5, obviously the Gentile Christians had instructions on the feast days. They were feast-keeping communities as they were Sabbath-keeping communities. The Roman Church has so bastardized Christianity and has so promoted apostasy that these feast days as the Sabbath are unknown. It is surprising that even among Sabbatarians are not known, because there was a prophecy in Daniel that they would think to change times. And now the times are the seasons. They have changed the seasons, coming in with the pagan Christmas and the pagan Easter. And there are different days of saints and all sorts of atrocities. The Roman Christianity has foisted on the world. And not all the Sabbatarians have been liberated. They retrieve one Sabbath, but the other Sabbaths. So I'm very happy that those who are having the opportunity to hear this presentation can go in prayer and ask the Lord to lead them on this important matter. He now says, it is clear that the early Christians were familiar with the timing of the festivals. And it seems quite plausible that many early Christians continued to observe the festivals. That is what Professor Keena says in his exegetical commentary on the book of Acts. We go to 1 Corinthians 5. As time is moving, we have to rapidly go to some of these texts. In 1 Corinthians 5, this is a Gentile area. Paul assumes familiarity with the Old Testament, read it Jewish, feast of unleavened bread. And immoral action was taking place there. A man was living with his father's wife. In the Old Testament celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I told you we couldn't have time to go into the meaning. You are seeking after God. All you want to find out first, that these days have to be kept. Later on, you can find out what they mean. We can talk about what they mean. That's another subject. The important thing is to suggest, is to show that the reasons you have had for thinking that they are abolished, that those reasons are invalid. That's the first thing. So we have very modest goals for today. To disabuse your mind of those reasons that you thought they shouldn't be kept. They are not good reasons. And two, for you to see that the early Christians used to keep these days. So if you are the successors of these early Christians, why aren't you keeping these days? Why aren't you walking in the same paths? If you are calling Protestants and calling Catholics to stop following the traditions of men and come back to Sabbath, then why aren't you going all the way and keeping the feast days? Those are my modest proposals today. Later on, so don't now confuse the issue. Well, what about how you're going to keep this? And those are other issues. It's coming like other people when you face with them the truth of the Sabbath. And they can't deal with it. They're going to tell you how you keep Sabbath around earth. And what about in Arctic Pole when you have so much buns of thing and you can't see sunset? You know, just reckon with the Bible. So you go all over the place now and you're going to say, well, when you're going to do it? And is it lunar Sabbath? Deal with the fact that the Sabbath must be kept. After we can deal with the other issues. So you don't bother come complicate this. Now, well, how are we going to keep unleavened bread? How are we going to keep so and so now? All you want to see is that the earliest believers used to do it. You not doing it, that is a problem. That's an issue where you have to go study. Something is missing. 1 Corinthians 5. Verse 6. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that little leaven leavens in the whole lump? If this were written in Hebrews, I could understand. You could say to me plausibly, well, you know something? These were Jewish Christians. They understood the Jewish Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Paul is drawing out some lessons. This is a Gentile area. They were not schooled in the Old Testament, and for your information, they didn't have the Bible where they could just read. They didn't have access to the Old Testament and could just read. They have to go to church and the man and read it from school. If they were not taught certain things, can you imagine today, most people don't even know about feast days. And them have Bible. And them have it on them, their mobile devices. Can you imagine at that time when they didn't have that? Long before even Gutenberg. The only way for Paul's analogy about little leaven and leaven the whole lump, the only way for that analogy to make sense was that the people were keeping the days of unleavened bread so that he could draw out spiritual lessons in this instance. Literary analysis shows you that. Contextual analysis shows you that. So Paul says, let us cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. He's using Paschal language. He's talking about the Passover and he's talking about the days of unleavened bread. Let us therefore celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice. Yes, you're going to say, but you seem spiritualize it. Yes. It spiritualizes it because there were people keeping these feast days, but they had malice and wickedness. And Paul was saying to them, what is the sense you're keeping feast days? And the reality of your life. It's like we as Sabbath keepers doing other things wrong. And God said to us, say, you know, what the sense you're putting all this emphasis on Sabbath, and you're not putting emphasis on holiness. 1 Corinthians 5 shows you that the Gentile Christians knew about the feast days. Paul says, let us keep the feast with a certain attitude. It means that the Corinthian church was keeping the feast of unleavened bread. It was not therefore abolished. 1 Corinthians 16. I'm rushing because of time. 1 Corinthians 16. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8, I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. Ephesus is not Jerusalem. Ephesus is a primarily Gentile area. Paul says he's going to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. He wanted to be with the brethren in Ephesus at Pentecost. This was Ephesus, it was not Jerusalem. And the people were keeping the feast at Ephesus. So this argument that you can only keep feast in Jerusalem and it is impractical to keep feast, it is a foolish argument. We see the evidence here. Paul wanted to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. In Acts 20, Philippians keeping feast day. 1 Corinthians 5, Corinthians keeping feast day. 1 Corinthians 16, Ephesian brethren keeping feast days. All of these instances. Look at Acts 27. We're moving rapidly. We understand your time. Respect your time. We know many of you have been to church from morning. Next time we will talk about the meaning of these days. That is not the most crucial thing. The most crucial, the most upsetting thing is We are finding that the early church used to keep the feast days, and you happen not to be keeping it today. That's a profound. You better deal with that first before you start running on to other things. That is itself. Acts 27 and verse 9. Since much time had already passed, Luke is doing the historical report. Since much time had already passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because the fast was already over. The fast was already over. If you look at your marginal reference, you know what that fast was? The fast was the Day of Atonement. No, who love? No, you really tell me. All of these days have been abolished. Luke writing many years after. What is the significance to the first hearers? What Luke tell about the fast already passed? You go in the marginal references, the Day of Atonement. The early church was still keeping the Day of Atonement by fasting. You must say, but Jesus come already. All right, that's for another time. What you must just look at here now is historical evidence that they were keeping. We can talk about the ramifications another time because we don't have the time. What is clear is that Luke, the historian, is saying, and this is not, again, this is talking about now a Gentile area. Paul sailing to Rome. This is not Jerusalem. You see, if it is Jerusalem, you know, you could have a plausible argument that, boy, just like how the Sunday people say, he was really going there, you know, to preach to the Jews. You could say, well, 1 Corinthians 9, man, Paul said to the Jews, I became like a Jew. Man, he was only showing them, no. This was among Gentiles. He had nothing to prove among the Gentiles. It is not like when the disciples call him and say, listen, man, you're in Jerusalem now, you know. The people them hear that you're not keeping the law, you know, brethren. So why go take some vows, you know? Well, show them they're keeping the law for strategic reasons. No! And Sunday people use it against Sabbath. No! He had no point to prove among the Gentiles. He had no point. And Acts, we have known traditionally, was aimed at a more Gentile audience. It shows you the evidence is strong. I think the evidence is coercive. That the earliest Christians here were keeping the feast days. That's why Paul could mention them so casually, as some scholars point out, because they continued to keep it. As Professor Keener says, they obviously were keeping the feast days longer than later Christians. In the 4th century, they abandoned it a long time. They had not abandoned it, just as though they had not abandoned Sabbath. But perhaps the biggest evidence of all is Zechariah 14. I have more to say, but time is going. And I have to respect all of you who went to church today and came here. My friend Martin and others. I respect, and this is a long presentation. You're not accustomed to such long presentation, but courtesy and interest. You have stayed, and I respect that, so I won't exploit it. Zechariah 14, a most decisive thing. Again, Adventist traditional use Isaiah 66. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come. One of the biggest arguments the Adventists use to show that Sabbath must be kept now is that the Sabbath is going to be kept in the millennium and beyond. One of the biggest arguments is Isaiah 66. And when I come with Zechariah 14, oh my Father, when I come with Zechariah 14 now and show you, suppose I were to show you that when Jesus comes back, people are going to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Suppose I were to show you that. Don't tell me you're going to tell me now that the church replaced Israel and that is not of any moment and significance. The same way the Sunday people use Isaiah 66 and say, oh, chow man, you can't say that. What happened was, and these sophisticated liberals, you know, it is just that Isaiah projected, and Isaiah saw worship in terms that only he could understand. And he could understand worship in terms of new moon. And he understood worship in terms of Sabbath. So when he saw an idealized time coming of God's people coming together, he used terms familiar back then. Just like how he didn't know about, modern science. And, Joshua talked about sun standing still. These theologians have ways of explaining. And you fall in the same trap now when I'm going to show you Zechariah 14. You're going to come with equally ingenious arguments against it. But I have an obligation to show it. Zechariah 14 is talking clearly about the coming of Christ. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, when the spoil is taken from you. Chapter 2 is a prophecy about Armageddon. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken. Then the Lord will go to fight against those nations. On that day, the Lord's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Now, Adventists believe that the millennium will be in heaven, and the earth will be desolate and all that other thing. So, if this is after the millennium, it's even more interesting. Right? If this is after the millennium, no. But listen to this. This is clearly kingdom. And on that day, so the Lord is going to go and fight against those nations. This is eschatological. It will be a unique day. Neither shall it be day nor night, but at evening time it shall be light. On that day living water shall flow out of Jerusalem. This is a prophecy. And this verse 12 is the plague that the Lord will plague all the nations that go to war. It shows what will happen to them. But look at verse 16. Everyone who is left of all the nations at Armageddon, everyone who is left of all the nations will come against Jerusalem, shall go up from year to year to worship the King and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. The people are to keep the Feast of Tabernacles after the Lord has returned. After the Lord has returned. If you read Zechariah 14, you cannot explain Zechariah 14 in terms of that taking place any time before Jesus has come. Everything about it is about the eschaton. And on that day, everyone who survives Armageddon will come to Jerusalem to worship. Verse 17, and if any of the families of Egypt do not go up, what is it saying? This is saying feast is universal. It's not just Jew man, not just Israelite woman to keep the feast. The people of Egypt are going to be required to go to the headquarters of God's government in Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And no Adventists will have questioned where them people will come from, and probation close, and people them died at the brightness of Christ coming. That is a problem for your theology. You can go sort that out. I am giving you a scripture here telling you. You will have the problem with that to answer. Satan chained by a chain of circumstances. Boy, Colin, I'm sorry you missed this thing, but good to have you. Zechariah 14. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to worship the King, there will be no rain on them. Verse 18, if the family of Egypt does not go up, there will be no rain. This will be the plague with which the Lord will smite the nations who do not keep the feast. Listen to me. God takes so seriously feast breaking, not just Sabbath breaking. God is going to punish people for breaking the feast days. Then if God is going to punish people in the millennium and after for punishing, what about now? Feast breaking, therefore, is sin. Feast breaking is transgression of the law. Just like Sabbath is transgression of the law. Zechariah 14 is to emphasize the importance of God's laws. All of the laws that are existing. Anybody who disagrees, verse 19, this shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all nations that do not go up. This passage says a lot. It says that the feast days were not just for Israel. This is not like a passage saying, well, we're going to bring back the temple in the thing and the Jewish people. No, no, no. This is a passage showing you, just like how Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, meaning it's universal. This passage by saying, if any nation don't keep it, shows you that the feast days are universal. Their meanings are universal. They are transcultural. So you have to reckon with that. And don't tell me now, well, you see that feast must be only kept in Jerusalem. No. The prophecies show Jerusalem as the headquarters of the government. God ruling from Jerusalem. Now I know that Adventists hold to replacement theology, that church has replaced, that's for another discussion. That's for you to work out. I'm giving you this passage. Here's the problem with the passage. From Adventist Church of God 70 theological perspective. 1, you can't locate this passage before the coming of Christ. Let me put out a challenge. There's no way you can interpret that passage as being any time before Jesus comes. If you interpret, before he returns second time. If you interpret and say, well, the millennium is going to be, nobody will be here, all right. You have more problem. Because if you have after Jesus come back, where these nations are going to be. Now, tomorrow I'm going to speak on that. Tomorrow I'm speaking here. Because tomorrow happens to be one of the feast days. Tomorrow is Pentecost. Actually, 2 Sabbaths, because tonight, no. You might not know, but tonight there's another Sabbath. 2 Sabbaths this weekend. So after this Sabbath here finished, now I'm keeping another Sabbath at the end of this. And tomorrow I am going to prove that this is not the only period of salvation. This is a very controversial doctrine. It's a, Armstrong teaching second chance. Tomorrow, by 1 o'clock, I am going to come here. I'm going to show that this concept about probation closing, that's not true. God is going to extend. What about the billions of people who never heard about Jesus? There are many people who have died not hearing about Jesus. What about the Taínos who were exterminated from this place before they brought their paganized Roman Catholic Christianity here? What about all our African brothers who died in the transatlantic voyage? What will happen to them who never hear about Jesus? What about in the many lands today where Christianity is banned and people are dying? God is going to wink at them. I'm going to show the plan of God tomorrow at 1 o'clock. That there is a plan, that God is just and God is loving, and that God will provide an opportunity for everyone. And this is what we're seeing here. So I'm going to show tomorrow at 1 that this is not the only period of salvation, but sufficient unto that day. Here is your problem. If you locate this after the millennium, you're in deeper problems. One thing is clear. Zechariah 14 is talking about the coming kingdom of God. If you now say the only possible explanation you could give me is the same explanation that people like Baldwin and others give in answer to Isaiah 66. That Zechariah 14 is not really talking about a literal feast. It is an idealized feast. Zechariah sees coming restoration of worship. He sees a perfect time coming. He sees Yahweh's victory over the enemies, over the nations that oppose Israel. He projects in the future according to his present understanding of the Israel cultus, and therefore we must not take him that he is really referring to any future. We must understand the writer. He is writing from his own limited perspective at that time, and he sees tabernacles, because tabernacles was the epitome of the Jewish feast. He sees the restoration of worship as being coterminous with that. That's the only possible explanation you could give me. In which case, that same explanation would have to apply to Isaiah 66. You cannot use that in the Crusades anymore. Just as though you cannot use Luke 4. You cannot use Acts 17. You can't use Acts 18. You can't use Acts 13. After this presentation, even if you were to reject the feast days, if you are to be consistent and honest, a lot of the arguments that you use, you must not use anymore. You must not tell Sunday people that they must keep Sabbath because Jesus, as his custom, was just keeping Sabbath. Unless you accept that in John 7, when the people were asking, where is Jesus? He must be here. It was his custom to keep tabernacles. You cannot use the Acts passages which refer to the disciples keeping Sabbath. You cannot use that except you use Acts 20 and verse 6. The Philippian Christians keeping. Unless you use 1 Corinthians 16, Paul saying the Ephesian Christians keeping Pentecost. Notice it now. There's a passage in the scripture that says that Paul said he was hastening to go to Jerusalem. I don't even quote that, you know. A lot of my other people quote it. I am not even going to quote that. Because lest you go and tell me that, well, you know, is they doing it because they were just following because of Jews. I don't do it. I only give you the text. I only give you the text that refer to when the Gentile Christians were keeping. I conclude in a couple of minutes by one, I'm going to give you evidence. The Roman Catholic, a well-known Roman Catholic bishop of Antioch, not Jerusalem, well-known Bishop John Chrysostom, Roman Catholic bishop. In a sermon he preached in AD 386, he preached a strong sermon against the feast days. Roman Catholic man. This is 4th century. You are going to see the significance of this statement. A major reason why the Catholic Church, the early Christians, stopped keeping Sabbath, start to push pork at Christmas. Double scandal. A major reason, anti-Semitism. They wanted to move. They said they don't want the church to have anything to do with any Jewish practice. Anti-Semitism was at the heart of the reasons for abandoning Sabbath, abandoning the feast days. I'm going to tell you what the bishop of Antioch, this is not Jerusalem, John Chrysostom said. He said in a sermon on AD 386, the festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to be upon us, one after the other in quick succession. Feast of Trumpets, Feast of Tabernacles, Day of Atonement. There are some in our ranks who say they think as we do. Yet some of these are going to keep the festivals. Up to the 4th century, the Catholic Church had to be fighting because they were still faithful Christians, keeping the Jewish festivals, so-called. That Bishop John Chrysostom had to put a sermon out and saying, you have some who still keeping these festivals. Yet some of these are going to keep the festivals, and others will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts. I wish to drive this custom out of the church now. And the Catholic Church was successful in driving out the custom of feast keeping and Sabbath keeping. Unfortunately, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and before them, the Church of God Seventh-day recovered the Sabbath. We thank them. We thank the Seventh-day Baptists who were the original people who recovered it. Seventh-day Baptists before, Seventh-day Adventists more known than them now, but they were the original Sabbath keepers in the New World. Seventh-day Baptists, then Church of God Seventh-day, and after the Seventh-day Adventists who have been more spectacular. People don't even know about Church of God Seventh-day much. Seventh-day Adventists have been extremely successful in their evangelistic outreach. We thank them for their great work that they have done in restoring the great memorial of the Sabbath. But the feast days need to be restored. The feast days are inextricably linked with the Sabbath. And it was a paganized Christianity that destroyed that link. I conclude by quoting from Mrs. E.G. White. Sister White, in commenting on the Feast of Tabernacles, says, well would it be for the people of God at the present time to have a Feast of Tabernacles, a joyous commemoration of the blessings of God to them. As the children of Israel celebrated the deliverance that God had wrought from their fathers, And as his miraculous preservation of them during their journeying from Egypt, so should we gratefully call to mind the various ways he has devised for bringing us out from the world and from the darkness of error into the precious light of his grace and truth. I would say to my Seventh-day Adventist friends that they should heed the words of Sister Ellen G. White.